Hello and welcome to the NVR Podcast, Season 2, Episode 7. I'm Rachael Aylmer.
And I'm Peter Jakob.
And today we're talking about the nature of non-violence. Is that what we agreed?
I think it is, yep.
Okay. We wanted to really bring to light some of the current affairs right now, didn't we? And talk about and acknowledge some of the suffering in our people. I'm just going to call them colleagues, but they're not. Do you want to start with that?
Yes, because I mean, in a sense, how could we not speak about Ukraine, particularly in the context of the Nonviolent Resistance podcast, when there is such appalling violence and the attention of the whole world, and is drawn to these horrendous events in Ukraine, and the sort of the warmongering violence, and so the many different aspects of violence, the physical violence, the assault on people, the lies, doing violence to a people through these distorted narratives, in which Putin makes out that Russia is the victim of Ukraine. When I heard some of those lies, some of my first thoughts went back to 1939.
Wow.
When Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union divided up Poland between themselves.
Yeah.
And Adolf Hitler spoke on the radio, and I don't remember his exact words, but he said, we have been shelled by Polish forces for many hours, and since I think 3:00 this morning, or I can't remember whenever, we have been returning fire, So mighty, powerful Nazi Germany making out that they were the victims of Poland. Actually, Nazi Germany, Hitler, and Stalin had agreed to simply split up the country between them. And it's those echoes of that past that really reverberated very strongly with me. And I sort of felt with so much violence and the focus on so much violence, it sort of seems hard to bring the conversation back to nonviolence.
Yeah.
And I don't know what you felt when our colleague Shila, was it Shila who sent round the images of that image of a woman in Moscow sitting in a, somewhere on a bus or in the subway. In the subway, wearing a yellow jacket and a blue headscarf and sitting there in silence in a dignified way. As an example of nonviolent resistance. And I just wonder what your reaction was to that when you saw that image.
Powerful, absolutely powerful, and brave. Just so brave in the light of the climate and the current situation, and the fear that must be everybody in Ukraine, but people in Russia who are experiencing that uproar of siding, placing their beliefs and values against the war and against Putin's decisions. But there's just been so many acts of resistance in the world right now against Russia, and not the world's greatest, politically minded person, but I'm witnessing and reading lots, and can't help but put so much of the work that we do in nonviolent resistance and marrying it up with these acts of resistance, and that the world are all bringing themselves together to resist Russia. And of course that's all controversial, isn't it? Because there are, thousands and thousands of people in Russia that are opposing that war and are not in favour of it at all. But, even just today I was looking at the news, and Sainsbury's have decided to change their name of their chicken Kiev and spell it the way that the Ukrainians would spell it, Kiev. So it's even tiny things about saying we're with you and we stand alongside you, and those acts of resistance that and how, the West are pulling away services, etc. to...
So that's an interesting thought, because, if we speak about the nature of nonviolence and the nature of resistance, it seems to me that part of nonviolence, both in terms of not being violent oneself, but also in terms of opposing violence, is solidarity. And I think you have been speaking just now about solidarity. That's what you've been speaking to, hasn't it? And even if it's calling your chicken Kiev, chicken Kiev.
Yes.
That's and that woman on the subway showing her solidarity, reaching out. No doubt people in Ukraine will be looking at that image.
Well, I guess someone on the subway, you could tell, secretly almost took that picture, and it's gone viral. And I just imagine that morning, that older lady getting up and getting dressed and finding her blue headscarf and then her bright yellow raincoat, putting it on with pride, and almost a message inside of her head saying, I don't care who sees me. I don't care if this even gets noticed, but I'm wearing this in solidarity for that other community, of which I know maybe she does have family in Ukraine, maybe not, I don't know, but it didn't matter, does it? She wasn't broadcasting it. It was her position that she chose. Yeah, I loved it.
And there was an interaction. There was her, and there was the person who took the picture of her and, put it on the internet, and it went viral. So there was a cooperation, a collaboration between two people who were resisting. And part of their resisting was reaching out to their fellow humans in Ukraine and communicating, we are with you. And even if it's just two people who are with them, leave alone so many more. I was also thinking of, I read that 500,000 people in Germany demonstrated. 500,000, that's as many. That I used to be an old hippie. It's as many people as went to Woodstock. 500,000 people. It's a huge number of people.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of the, when we talk about the nature of nonviolence and this aspect of it, and I'm sure there are many facets to nonviolence. But this one facet or this one aspect of it, which is, I'm with you.
I'm with you.
And in our work, when we work with families, when we work with schools, when we work with foster carers, with residential care, to help supporters show that they are with the family, but also to help the parents communicate to the young person that they are with the young person, even the young person who is showing aggression. I'm this message of I'm with you, not said in words, but in deeds. And that to me seems a very powerful aspect. Shall I share an example of where that didn't happen?
Yeah, because that's nice. People want to hear when it didn't happen. They don't always want to hear our when it's really worked and it's been successful. They don't want to know that.
Well, it's interesting because it didn't happen, but I thought about what it would have been like if it had happened. And coming up to today's podcast, I thought, well, maybe I'll send the young person a letter sharing my thoughts about what would have happened if it had happened. So what did happen was things were going on, and this young teenage boy, beginning in September, was becoming very obstreperous at his secondary school. And the secondary school operates with a behavior policy.
Don't they all?
Most of them do, yes. And these behavior policies are actually an escalating list of punishments.
Yeah.
So I think what a lot of people in secondary schools don't realize that what they end up engaging in often is what we call symmetrical escalation. Mm-hmm. There's often symmetrical escalation between the young person and between teachers at the school. Mm-hmm. And the young person's escalation is to become more and more obstreperous, more and more rude, pushing the boundaries further, maybe kicking a desk over at some point. And the school's response is more and more exclusion. So it's an exclusionary escalation. You get behavior points. You get so and so many behavior points, you get detention. That's an exclusion from the community of the school. Mm. You get more behavior points. You get internally excluded, usually into the aptly named inclusion room.
Inclusion room.
Yeah. And then you get excluded from school altogether, 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, and then you get permanently excluded in the worst case scenario. So in this school, there were some teachers who were trying to work with NVR, set up a positive campaign of concern. That one teacher was coordinating, feeding back to the boy that people realized and appreciated constructive things he was doing. But overall, there were still too many teachers who were reacting very quickly, striking the iron when it was hot, rather than, as we do, strike the iron when it's cold. And it would come like shot out of their mouths, behavior points. And for example, on one occasion, he was stopped by a teacher and told he should be in such and such a class, but actually he had a good reason. I can't remember what the reason was. So the teacher just understood what he was doing as talking back, 3 behavior points, and so forth. So the boy seemed to get more and more disaffected. And with getting disaffected at school, he got more and more dismissive of his parents, because that's how he seems to deal with things that trouble him. And finally, the straw that broke the camel's back was when his head teacher, and this is what I wanted to get to, his head teacher pulled him up or told him off about his uniform. He was wearing a hoodie under his blazer that was not allowed or something. Apparently, the boy also is touch sensitive to the normal jumper, which is actually why he wears the hoodie, because it's fleece, But anyway, he was told off by the head teacher in front of his mates. And he said to her, you really piss me off. 5 behavior points. And, there was a permanent exclusion.
So 5 is the maximum, is it?
Well, he'd had so many, they were just piling up, the behavior points. And so I sat back and I thought about what happened there. And I thought, okay, there was probably shame involved on both sides. He felt embarrassed, shamed in front of his mates. I have memories of when I was an adolescent and how fragile your sense of pride can be.
Yeah, it's very important.
Yeah, at the best of times, right?
Yeah.
And how much worse it is when you are told off in that way in front of people, and more so in front of your peers. And then I thought maybe the head teacher felt shamed as well by the young person because she felt he's disrespectful and undermining her authority.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, if I'd had the opportunity to consult the head teacher, what would I have told her? And I thought, okay, I probably would have told her, why don't you invite him up to your office after school? And why don't you bring him a nice cup of tea and some biscuits and have a cup of tea for yourself and sit down with him? And I would have said, why don't you say to him, look, don't get me wrong. I don't like, I've got to talk to you about your uniform because that's part of the rule of the school, and we're a community that is bound by rules. And I didn't like the way you talked to me, but I'd like to understand. Maybe you can help me understand what it was that upset you when we spoke to each other. And you felt compelled to say you pissed me off. Well, how did you get pissed off? And I just thought, well, what would have an outcome of that been? Particularly with him holding onto his cup of tea and scoffing some of the biscuits. I would always recommend chocolate biscuits. Highly recommend. If not even a chocolate brownie. Very good material to bribe a young person. I thought he probably would have walked away thinking she's a really nice woman. He might have walked away feeling understood. He might have walked away feeling she's with him as a person. They were at opposite sides of an argument, but he might have felt, okay, she's with him and she's willing to step out of her own skin in order to reach out to him and to learn about him and engage in in what I call a caring dialogue. So this is what I thought. And I thought, okay, so the way, if you think of violence and nonviolence, if you think of that as not as, something is either violent or it's not violent, but if you think of it as a spectrum, at one end of the spectrum, perhaps there's extreme violence. There's the killing of a person, taking of a life, inflicting pain. And at the other end of the spectrum, there is sort of, a total acceptance of the other, an opening of myself for the other. Then we could maybe plot along that axis. We can plot where someone's act lies. And when the head teacher said 5 behavior points, my sense is she moved a little more, particularly with a stern face and an angry tone of voice, she moved a little bit more towards violence. Had I been able to talk to her, had she invited him to her office, had a cup of tea with him, and carried out those responses, she would have moved a little bit more towards nonviolence. And so this example has been going through my head a lot in the last few days.
Do you know what strikes me is that parting moment of the teacher and the kid. So the kid goes back to the home wherever he lives. The teacher goes home to wherever she lives, the head teacher. And there lied the discourse. No repair.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the teacher thought about the kid. Maybe she felt some compassion. Maybe she reflected. I don't know. But perhaps for the kid, the memory of that incident can lie deeply. Let's assume it was a Friday that's carried over the weekend. That feeling of the young person can then display in other characteristics in the family over the weekend. That shame because it's not talked about. That feeling, and then he arrives at school Monday. Let's assume if he's not excluded, and he carries in that frame of mind of which was left. No repair, no desire for repair. No repair is going to happen. It's not going to happen. But now it's even more ingrained in his makeup. And so I think for me, the act of repair, the act of raising teacher presence in that particular way, that teacher taking a step out of her role as a head and inviting that kid to spend some time, to give him a biscuit, to give him a cup of tea, to sit down in a room as one, and thrash out what's going on for you. That wasn't okay earlier. Let's have a chat. And how much that would have shifted perhaps for the boy for the rest of the evening. And the teacher goes home knowing that she'd made the attempt to repair. She might have been rejected.
Yeah.
He might have sat and sulked and still been quite wounded from his 5 behaviour points. But how the teacher would have felt.
In my version, she wouldn't have given him behavior points.
Right.
Because I think the behavior points, that is moving out of one's presence. The behavior points, to me, represent what perhaps 100 years ago, or maybe even less, would have been a switch. The teacher would have used a switch. Instead, today, we have behavior points. In my version, the head teacher is herself. And I was just thinking what you just said about him going home at the weekend. And of course, what happened was he went home at the weekend and he was in a bad mood. And he bothered his sister, pushed his sister around, shouted at a parent. So it's almost like it's a stone, isn't it? And the ripples go out, 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 out. So it's almost like you've put a drop of violence into the world.
Yeah, you deposited it.
You've deposited it, and it has repercussions. It goes through the different systems. How does it affect the sister? If sister suffers, how does it and actually, do you know what the little girl said at one point? I don't know whether it was immediately after this, but in that context, she used to, and she adored and adores her big brother, as younger siblings often do. She said, he used to be my best friend. He used to be my best friend. So there was real sadness in that. And I'm imagining, the struggle for the parents to de-escalate, and how that struggle just becomes that much more difficult.
Yeah.
When the boy takes his bad mood home, which comes from a rupture not having been repaired. So maybe what you've spoken about is that the repair of relational rupture, it's a peaceful drop in the water, isn't it? Or a peaceful stone in the water that has peaceful ripples. So what we can often do in being nonviolent is putting in peaceful pebbles in the water to cause peaceful ripples.
It's funny because I was literally just thinking about a client I worked with this week where one of the parents described an incident in the family home before the young person was being picked up for the school that he resides in. And there was some resistance from the young person to get up and get himself organised. And so what happened was the lift went without him, the taxi, and then the parent had to take the boy in independently. And the parent describes that journey into school as quite frosty. The parent was still hurt and angry from, there wasn't any violence, but there was a lot of resistance. And the parent described dropping the young person off at the school. And I talked with the parent about the hurt and anger that continued to stay with them for many hours, if not the next day. And then I asked whether there was any contact between her and the young person, and there wasn't, or wasn't going to be until the young person returns for the weekend. And I asked the parent to consider how the young person was feeling. And I asked the parent to imagine, as I often do, what it would have been like to have reached out to him later in the day via a text. And I called it a social squeeze, like a social media squeeze. So it's a non-verbal squeeze that you reached out. And I wondered if the message would say something like, I know this morning was difficult. I hope you settled in this afternoon. I love you. I love you. Just something really simple.
Yeah.
The boy would receive from the parent as a bit of a squeeze, as a hug, as a kind of, I'm thinking of you.
Yeah.
Because I was really mindful of that repair. That those two people had parted, young person in a school for the rest of the week, the parent goes home, and how that discourse just stayed with them, that disruption. And I think there's something so valuable about what you described then about that repair, the rupture and the repair.
What do you think that message is, that squeeze? What is the parent saying without words? I mean, they are using words.
Oh, you matter.
You matter.
We've talked about mattering, haven't we? You matter.
You matter.
So for people to matter is such an important part of our human behaviour. Mattering also supports our values and beliefs because it matters. It means something, and knowing that you mean something to me is important. It matters. And I think how lovely for a young person to receive a message, even if they reject it and rebuff it, that the message is still being read or acknowledged or seen, that you matter. I'm holding you in my mind. I'm thinking about you. The old woman on the subway with the blue and the yellow, she's saying, Ukraine, you matter to me. And I stand and sit here.
And I reach out to you.
Yeah.
I don't know whether this is a far reach, but what suddenly popped into my mind was the other day I was listening to a podcast on Radio 4 of In Our Time. And it was about the Russian anarchist and intellectual and biologist, Kropotkin, who, by the way, was not an anarchist who was that much into terror attacks and stuff like that. I think someone even wrote a book about him called The Gentle Anarchist.
Okay.
And Kropotkin grew up reading Darwin, who was sort of hot off the press. And at the time, there was a kind of social Darwinism in public discourse, because Darwin's idea of the survival of the fittest, and it was kind of a dog-eat-dog Darwinism. you know. And Kropotkin went to Siberia to do some research or something. And he observed animals, and he found these animals helping one another. He saw animals helping each other selflessly. So against their own immediate personal interests. And he developed the concept of mutual aid. And Kropotkin made that as a contribution to evolutionary biology. He said, many species have not been successful necessarily just because their individuals have been particularly robust, and certainly not because they have hurt or warred or destroyed other individuals of their own species. But actually, as a group, they've been successful by supporting each other and through selflessness.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently, he made the comment that one day we might even see mutual aid in spawn in a pond, or in a pond scum. And apparently, research biologists are just doing that. And there was a research biologist who spoke about one of his PhD students demonstrating empathy in rats, and rats sacrificing themselves for the benefit or the survival of other rats, as an example of mutual aid. So, and I was just thinking how different that outlook on life and outlook on the world is. That Kropotkin put forward, that there is mutuality rather than only dog eat dog. Is it dog eat dog or wolf? I don't want to do dogs an injustice. I love dogs.
Dog eat dogs, yeah. An eye for an eye.
Yeah. Dog eat dog, an eye for an eye. Might is right. All these things that we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine right now on the world scene, and that we see on the micro level.
Yeah.
Where the micro can reflect the macro, and reaching out, acting in solidarity, showing you matter. All aspects of nonviolence, really, or part of the nature of nonviolence and mutual aid, to quote Kropotkin.
You rounded that up beautifully. Thanks for that.
A more somber podcast today, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, we're, I guess, in a somber state of affairs right now, aren't we?
Yeah.
Coming out, the UK coming out of a pandemic and out of the lockdowns, and now Russia have hit Ukraine hard.
Yeah.
With a war, a cold war. So yeah.
A hot war.
Hot one.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's almost made the pandemic pale into insignificance, hasn't it? It's so.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, but we could talk a lot about that. But I guess we've come to a nice natural end to our podcast this week. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Rachel.
It's lovely having you back.
Yeah, it's good being back.
Okay, well, that's goodbye from me.
And from me. Have
Bye.
a good day.